Good morning. It's good to be here with you this morning. If you would open up to 1 Peter chapter 2, that's where we're going to be taking a look. 1 Peter chapter 2. Josh read a wonderful passage for us that is very interesting, and I'm sure talking about Balaam would be great at some point, and we might do that. But right now we are in 1 Peter chapter 2, an easy mistake to make. In fact, I thought the mistake was mine. It sounded pretty likely. But we are going to be looking at relationships, sort of in general, but especially with submission. And so in your life, you have hundreds of relationships, whether you even recognize it or not. You have relationships with your friends, potentially, certainly with any family member that you have, even relationships with people that you hardly know that might check you out at the grocery store. You have a relationship to the government on the state level, on the federal level. That'll come up in our lesson. And you have a relationship, most importantly, with God. And so we want to look at how we handle those relationships and specifically what 1 Peter is going to tell us about that. And just to set this up with the shortest amount of context that we can give, 1 Peter is a letter written to a group of people who are scattered, who are facing persecution, who are in a difficult position, especially in connection to their own government, who is abusing them, who's persecuting them. And so Peter calls them out to say, you are different, you are holy, and you should act that way. And in spiritual terms, you're your own nation. You're a special chosen race of God. But in earthly terms, it's not going to look like that. And so he's going to tell them in verses 11 and 12 of our chapter 2 of 1 Peter. He says, "Beloved, I beg you as sojourners, as pilgrims," using that same language again, "abstain from fleshly lust, which war against the soul, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works, which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation." And so Peter's telling his audience that in this world you're just passing through, as we sometimes sing, but to abstain from those things which are evil. Don't get caught up in the things of the world, even though that's where you live. And ultimately what that's going to do is it's going to make sure that when people try to speak against you, all they can really do is glorify God, saying that you are engaged in such and such behavior, but in reality, that's not a bad thing. That is to God's glory. In our text that we're going to start looking at in verse 13, it starts out by saying, "Therefore submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme," in verse 14, "or to governors, or to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of those who do good." And so when we start into this text, it gives us an idea of submission, but what we're submitting to might be a little unclear at first. At least in my translation of the New Testament here, it says to submit yourselves to every ordinance. That's probably not the best word we could use, and even in my copy of the Bible, it has a footnote that says institution, and that is more of what's meant, but what we're talking about is government. We're talking about those things that have been created among men to govern over them. And so he says submit to them, whether to the king, that is the ruler of that government, or to the governors that are on the more local level. And so we are to submit to these things, whether they be, again, federal or local. They serve God. In verse 14, they're sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and to praise that which is good. Now, do governments always do those two things perfectly? They do not. But in theory, that's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to, with the power that God has given to them, that they should punish evil, they should praise what is good. Sometimes those get reversed even. But in verse 15, it says, "This is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men." Verse 16, "As free, yet not using liberty as a cloak for vice, but as bondservants of God." In these couple of verses here, Peter gives us the reasons that we are to be submitting to government. It's not always something pleasant to do, but he outlines it here. He says, first and foremost, we do this because it is the will of God. Okay. Now again, if you don't like everything about the government that you live under, that shouldn't be shocking, especially because Peter's not writing to people that live in the United States. Peter's writing to people that live under Roman rule. And so when he says that you submit to this government because it's the will of God, that's pretty hard. And yet that's how it's supposed to be. But that's not the only reason. He also gives the same reason as verse 12 did, that by doing good, you can put other people to silence. And so some people will look at Christians and say, well, they're doing this thing, or maybe in their life personally they have this character flaw. And Peter says, just live in a good way before men, so that when they try to charge you with these things, that they'll be the ones that are made to look foolish. And the third thing he says is in verse 16, not to use this as a cloak for vice, but as bondservants of God. It's kind of a strange phrase there. But what Peter intends to say is that we can't look at our Christianity as an excuse to not do certain things, in particular, not to submit when that's what is appropriate. And so sometimes you'll have someone that will make this kind of argument that says, well, I don't have to do fill in the blank because I'm a Christian. And they could even use the argument from earlier in this chapter talking about being their own holy nation, and say, well, if I'm my own holy nation, my nation doesn't require me to pay taxes, right? That's an idea, at least, to say, well, I'm a Christian, therefore I don't have to do the things of this world. And Peter says, no, that's not how that's supposed to work. The submission goes beyond just lip service. It goes into actually doing what is good or even what's commanded of you. Verse 17 sums up Peter's point pretty well here. And this is one of the best constructed verses in the New Testament as far as getting the point across. It says, honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Simple enough. If you want a recipe for how your relationship is supposed to look with other people, here it is. And so we have these 4 different parts. The one thing you can do with this is kind of look at it as the different groups to which you are in a relationship that you're related to. Honor all people. So kind of looking at society as a whole. How do you respond to them? With honor, at least in a general sense. Love the brotherhood. Brotherhood, talking about the church there. So what should be your relationship to the church? It should be one of love. The love of God, certainly, the love of Christ. With society, the difference is that we honor society, showing them the love of God, the love that we have for fellow man in general, and any other respect that we owe them as other people that were made in the image of Christ. But with the church, instead, there's a deeper level here of the love of Christ to be shown to them, and even like in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10, that we should do good to all, but especially to those of the household of faith. Our affection, our giving even, should be directed toward those who we love within the brotherhood. The third one there in verse 17 is to fear God. Now, it doesn't say to fear all man. It doesn't say even to fear the brotherhood, and it doesn't say to fear the king. It says to fear God. He's in a category all himself. He does not fit into any of these other groups, and so the relationship is going to be different. It's one of fear. That is one of total humility before God, one of complete respect before God, one that recognizes God as awesome as He is. And so we stand before Him in awe. At least that's the idea. And then in the last part of this, it says to honor the king. Now, if you notice closely, the first statement and the last statement both use the word honor. It says honor all people and honor the king. And so do you put the king on the same level as you put everybody else out in society? Is that what Peter means? Not quite so much. In the original way that this is worded, from the original language being Greek here, the word means to estimate something's value. And so what it's actually saying is that you give the proper value to all people, and you give the proper value to the king as well. Are those values the same? Not really. And so you're valuing what something is worth. You're giving it the proper degree of honor or of respect. But again, in this text, it does help to summarize everything that Peter's trying to say here. But one thing we might point out is that it says to honor the king. It doesn't say to fear the king. It says to honor the king, and it doesn't say that you have to necessarily like the king. It says earlier in the text to submit to the king, submit to the governors. It doesn't say you always have to like them, but it does say that you have to submit and that you have to give honor where it is due. In the next verse, verse 18, we'll try to cover this portion pretty briefly, but next couple verses here. Verse 18, it says, "Servants, be submissive to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the harsh. For this is commendable, if because of conscience toward God one endures grief, suffering wrongfully. For what credit is it if when you are beaten for your faults you take it patiently, but when you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, this is commendable before God." Peter switches not his discussion, he's still talking about submission here, but he switches it from the large scale, talking about government, talking about society as a whole, talking about the brotherhood as a whole, and now he switches to talking on the household level, which may not be obvious at first. Again, when we go back to the original language here, just because it helps us to understand, the word for servant here is not even the same word for servant as in verse 16, where it says bondservant, which really means more of a slave. The word for servant in verse 18, and some of your translations might reflect this, is a household servant. That is someone who works within the house. And so now we're talking not about how we relate to government, but we're talking about, well, how do you relate to the people that you live with, the people who are closer to you? That being said, this is still a master and servant relationship in view. And so what Peter says is that servants are to be submissive or to put themselves under the people that are their masters, even within their house. And they are to do this whether the master is gentle or whether they are harsh. There's only one master that someone can serve that is perfect, that being God. And so every other master will have their flaws, but this goes beyond just flaws. Peter says even if your master is harsh, even if they overwork you, even if they abuse you, even if they mistreat you, you still serve them. And he gives reasons for that as well. One reason, verse 19, is that this is commendable. That is, it's a good, worthwhile thing to do, but more importantly, because of conscience toward God. That is to say that you suffer these wrongs not because it's fun, not because it makes a whole lot of sense from an earthly perspective, but because it pleases God. Not because it pleases the master that you serve, but because it pleases the true master that you should be serving. Verse 20 goes even farther to say that if you do suffer, but you suffer because you've done wrong, that's no good. Doesn't really amount to anything. But if you suffer because you've done nothing wrong, then there is credit to be given there. From this, Peter will switch into talking about Jesus the Christ. Is that a far jump to make from talking about someone suffering who is innocent and that being commendable before God to switching to talking about Jesus? And so he'll use Jesus obviously as the example here, but I think if we can simplify this a little bit, what Peter's saying is be submissive to all people, certainly. Be submissive ultimately to government because it's the will of God. And be submissive to your masters. But every time he says to be submissive to some other person or some other group, he gives the same reason, which is because it's a good thing to do for God. We don't serve, we don't submit ourselves to other people or other entities, other organizations, just because we want to, or just because it helps us in a financial way, or because it's beneficial to us to get ahead in life in some way. In fact, service and submission make no earthly sense. They really don't, unless you're doing it for money or doing it for some other advantage. But that's Peter's whole point here, is to say submission is not about serving just so you'll get something in return. Submission is about serving because it's what God's will is for you. And because ultimately there is a better reward that comes from it. And so in the earthly sense, why would you submit? But in the eternal sense, there is a reason for doing so. And there's an eternal reason for doing so. The promise of a reward, not from the earthly masters, not even from the elders of a church, not from the government, not from any outside source, but from God, who gives the ultimate reward. Verse 21, just to introduce this, but we'll leave this for another time. Verse 21, it says, "For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow his steps." If you want an example, a perfect example, of how submission doesn't make any sense on an earthly scale, don't you see it in Christ? Did it make any sense for Jesus to come to this earth, to be subordinate to a government, to be subordinate to parents, to rabbis, and ultimately to the Pharisees, the scribes, and those who put him on the cross? Did he need to do that? In a spiritual sense, as the plan of God, sure. But did he really need to do that just from the pure aspect of submission? No. He could have called 10,000 angels, as we sang, or 12 legions of angels, more accurately. But he chose to do that, not because he needed to be submissive to any of those people, but to be submissive to God, because he had a higher goal in mind. And so our submission is the same, or it should be. For us, there is a higher goal in mind, for us who are Christians. That being said, for those who suffer, all people suffer. For those who are suffering in this life, if they suffer without the promise of a reward in heaven, what is the benefit of their suffering? What's the benefit of their submission? There's very little. There is some, perhaps, but there's very little. And for those who suffer in this life, if they don't serve God, mostly they're just suffering. And that's all there is to it. That's the end of the story. But for those who suffer in Christ, there is reward. The other thing we might say with this is that submission, we've kind of pointed this out, but submission is a choice to be made. Jesus chose to be in submission to the events that ended his life. Sometimes things are out of our control, but when it is available to us, submission is a choice. That doesn't mean that we seek it out all the time. It doesn't mean that we look for persecution or that we look to be subjected to others. But when that does happen, we serve in this way because of God. It also may seem that there's a kind of contradiction here in what Peter has told us. The first part of this chapter even speaks about being a separate people. The end of chapter 1 talks about being holy, not being like the world. And yet here Peter says, don't be like the world, but when the world tells you to do something, you need to listen. You need to submit to the things that the world at least commands for you to do. And so which one is it? Well, the answer should be easy enough. First off, there is some room for abstaining from fleshly lust, back in verse 11. There is room for saying, well, yes, obviously government has decided that this is what should happen, and yet we look to God and say, which is greater, God or government? Well, the person who institutes something is greater. And so we listen to God rather than to man. So that's one answer to this. We can be holy sometimes in spite of what we would normally submit to by not submitting. But that's rarely the case. When it's not the case, though, submission, for its part, it kind of does set us apart. How many people in the world are there that believe nothing or they don't believe in God? They act purely for themselves, for their own motives, and yet they are submissive in their relationships. Is that common, that you get rid of God and keep submission perfectly? But instead for us, because we are submitted to God in the first place, then the rest of our relationships should reflect that as well. And so that by itself, people should be able to look at us and tell by the relationships that we have and how willing we are to serve in those relationships, to put ourselves last in those relationships and be submissive in those relationships. That should define that we are Christian, that we are set apart based on the way that we interact with others. And so submission can, in fact, do this, to set us apart, whether that's a child and parent relationship or a spousal relationship, an employer, an employee, or even with government, but of course, most importantly, with God. It's rare that you have let's say a wife who is not submissive to her husband and yet perfectly submissive to God. It's rare that you have an employee who is constantly disgruntled with their bosses and yet loves every aspect of submission to God. And so we should, because of our submission to God, be willing to submit in these other cases as well. This morning, this has just been a study of this text. The subject is pretty constant throughout the text, that of a little bit of service, but mostly our willingness to submit. And the reason being given each time is because we first submit to God so that we can submit to all of these other relationships as well. But this morning, if you need to submit to God for the first time, this is a wonderful opportunity to do so. If you have not done that, again, your other relationships probably aren't going to work out for the best, but submission to God starts with looking at His Word and what He has decided for each of us to be saved, to take a look at that and say, yes, because He has said it, those are the things that I'm willing to do. And if you need help in understanding that this morning, or this morning if you have some other need from the congregation, whether to become a child of God, whether to come back to God, or anything else, we ask that you come forward as we stand, as we sing.